Hi there. Welcome to the podcast Matters and Meaning. And this is an episode that is carrying over from our previous episode on the fickleness of power. And in the previous episode, went into some historical examples, a couple which kind of focused in on the nature of humanity as it regards to power and its pursuit. Two other ones that pointed at the fickleness of power in regards to time, how it may seem it's going to last forever, but then you realize just a couple decades or a few decades later, it's ashes under Uricon, and the example I gave of that great poem. And then we rounded it out with an example of, somebody who considered the possibility for power to be unshakable and found out very quickly that power is never unshakable. So we kind of went in and dug into the historicity of this idea of the fickleness of power. And in this episode today, what we want to do is we want to dig into some more nuanced realities as we approach this topic. Now, specifically in regards to the two questions of, number one, why do people cling to power? And then number two, with such obvious historical examples of how power is so fickle, why is it that people are still so prone to wanting to pursue it? When history so clearly tells us that you can do that, but in the end, is it truly worth it? And people doing that cost-benefit analysis, and so often people are very much wanting to do it. So that's kind of what we're going to dig into today, closing it out with kind of approaching it from a worldview perspective and applying meaning to this topic, as we want to do in this podcast. So thanks for stopping by, and I look forward to talking about this topic. Thanks. What is your worldview? How does that worldview shape and form your understanding of meaning? In this podcast, we discuss various matters of interest and value. But in the end, we want to know the deeper meaning of these matters and how they apply to the world around us and to ourselves. My name's Jonathan. Join me as I search out deeper meaning and understanding into the matters at hand. So before I start talking about the kind of the nuts and bolts of this podcast and this second episode of the Fickleness of Power, I wanted to take a second as I was kind of looking around where I film and where I record. I saw a few things. So above me up here is a trumpet, and that's actually a speaker. Your iPhone goes into this thing right here, and then and then sound goes out of the trumpet. It's pretty cool. And then over here I have a coffee mug from a place called Badcraft. And Badcraft was a small kind of call it like a pub / art gallery that was really cool. And it was in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And for a time, I don't know if it's there still, but the reason I say that is I was looking and kind of seeing those things. It brought to mind the friends and the people that I knew in Black Mountain, right next to Swannanoa, places like Chimney Rock, and then Buncombe County as a whole, and people up there, that hurricane that came through and the devastating flooding that took place. I saw those things, and I felt like it was important at the beginning of this podcast for me just to, I don't know if anybody would ever see this episode that lives in those areas, but if anybody is from those areas in North Carolina, the Black Mountain area, Chimney Rock, Swannanoa, those places that I previously referenced, if for any reason, by any random circumstance, somebody from that area the Asheville area may watch or see a portion of this episode, I just want those people to know that, I'm a random guy that lives an hours away from where you guys are. And I just want you to know that we're still thinking of you guys. And I know that when it comes to a practical perspective, it's like, hey, dude, we're still building the infrastructure just to even rebuild it all. So you saying we're thinking about you means a whole lot of nothing. So I appreciate the fact that that doesn't carry much substance with it. However, I just want anybody who is from that area to know that you were still thought of and you have not been forgotten by other people. And the damages that were done in that place, I'm sure it's going to probably take 5 to 10 years to even be remotely close to what normal would have been considered prior to the floods themselves. I'm sure it would take probably years just to rebuild the infrastructure alone in certain areas. So if anybody's from that area that should ever see this episode or ever have a listen, I just want you to know that you're thought of still, that you're not forgotten about, and that, there are people who consider you guys and think about you guys, pray for you guys. I just wanted to, looking at these things that are on the shelves behind me, they give me memories. And I had some great memories with family in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And it was a town that was filled with some great people. And I was just thinking a lot about them today. Even the sticker on this coffee mug right here, that sticker's from Badcraft as well. So I just thought about those guys today and just wanted to say that at the onset. So transitioning from that to kind of getting into the topic today of the fickleness of power in light of approaching it not from the historical perspective as we did in the previous episode, but approaching it now from more of a psychological perspective and then also into the worldview component of things. And I wanted to start with these two questions, which is, why is it that people seem to cling on to power? And then why is it that people, in spite of the reality that history so clearly teaches us that power is so fickle, why do people still pursue it to the point of destroying themselves, destroying others? It's just, I would argue that it's the nature of man that is involved in that reality that would disregard such obvious common sense and wisdom for the pursuit of that. I think that kind of speaks to the nature of man. However, we'll get more into that. But what I wanted to start with was the idea of letting go of power. So why is it that some people will let go of power and some people, they'll fly the plane into the ground trying to hold on to power? I wanted to give one brief historical example of somebody who was in a position of the pinnacle of power who let it go. And this is going to go back to the ancient Romans. It goes back to 458 BC. And it goes back to a man by the name of Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus. So let me say that again, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus. And this individual was known for being a farmer. And in essence, what happened is he was given two different dictatorships in Rome in order to respond to conflict. So virtually what ended up happening in Rome is Rome was so adverse to kings that you look at the history of the ancient Romans, the idea of a king. Anybody who considered themselves to be king or wanting to be king, they killed him. It was a tension that Julius Caesar kind of fought with in terms of, being willing to or denying a laurel wreath in front of everybody saying, no, I don't want to be a king. I don't want to be a king. You had the most brilliant political maneuvering in the history, potentially of the world, by Caesar Augustus and his ability to kind of give the perception of not wanting to be king or not being the most powerful individual. However, wanting to adopt the term of princeps for citizen, not being known as king or emperor, but being known as princeps, and then also mirroring that with a relatively humble living as much as can be possible by an individual in that standing at that time. So, you have people in ancient Rome who, when a dictator was put in place, it was centralizing power in a single individual to handle a crisis. And then once that crisis had been averted or had been overcome, that individual would then leave power and then move on. And obviously a guy like Julius Caesar, dictator for life, obviously Caesar Augustus, his adopted son, posthumously, I think learned from his example and was able to navigate those waters to result in the establishment of the Roman Empire itself. But the reason I give all of that is just to kind of give an idea of what a dictatorship in ancient Rome would be. Now, again, that's a very wave-top, surface-level, non-historian explanation of that. If you want a deeper understanding, you can look into people who actually know. But Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus was brought into first in a dictatorship to deal with a conflict with I don't say this right. It's Aequi, the Aqui, maybe. But in the end, he was appointed dictator to do battle with these individuals and overcome them, in which he did. It was said that after about 21 days, I believe that's the right number. If it's wrong, I apologize. But after 21 days, he resigned his dictatorship and returned to his farm. And then you have a second dictatorship in 439 BC, where there's a grain shortage and a crisis with a plot to overthrow the republic. And Cincinnatus is again called in as dictator. He restores order, quells the rebellion, and again steps down and returns to his farm. So in both of those situations, you have a man who comes into a position of ultimate power and authority. And instead of once gaining that power and authority, trying to hold on to it and maintain it, or jockey into a position where he can continue to maintain it, he lets it go and goes back to a life of obscurity. So that's an example of somebody who was in a position of power and then relinquished that power when the time came. And so that's one approach that I think obviously most people would consider to be pretty healthy. So what's the flip side of that coin? Well, what I want to do is I want to give two examples utilizing American politics. Now, what I want to be very clear on this, and I referenced this in my first episode of Words Matter, and this is an example of me wanting to make sure that I'm towing that line and making sure that wasn't just words for the sake of words. It wasn't just, hey, I want to do this because it sounds cool for a first episode. Like, no, genuinely, I hope that this is foundational for any episodes that I record for this podcast, which is that words matter. And so when I go into the descriptions of these two individuals, I want it to be very clear. This is not meant to slander them, right? This is just meant to call out what would be, from my perspective, a perception that I think is not very far out to imply into this situation, right? And so two individuals, and I'm going to use people from both political parties, right? Because I don't want this to turn into a, hey, I'm focusing in on one or the other. This is going to be two examples. One's a senator, one's a former president who it seems like they've just clinged on to it for so long. And it's like, to what end and to what purpose? And so the first example is the Senator Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. The reason I use him as an example is there were interviews where he physiologically froze in front of the reporters and the people he was with, and had to be escorted away. And the second example is the former president, President Biden. And having watched some of the things that he presented in speeches, it was very evident that his ability to verbally communicate wasn't there. And so that's a Republican example and a Democrat example, both of which are very clear, obvious examples of people who are so old and who physiologically have come to such a point where they're either freezing and unable to say anything and having to be led away. Now, this isn't obviously all the time. These are intermittent situations, and the same would apply to the former president. There were times where he could speak fine. However, there were very clearly situations in which he could not. And the point that I'm making is what drives people in both of these situations to where when you physiologically are at the point in your life where you are starting to shut down in your capacity to even communicate at all, you're still wanting to be in power. And what does that say about somebody's worldview? What does that say about somebody's approach, right, to the idea of power? Because as I look at that from the outside looking in, these two individuals they're going to be very well off financially. They're not going to need for anything. And it's one of those things of, wouldn't you rather be with family? And, these are both individuals who are up there in years and who, these men could outlive me because I could walk out my door, slip on a banana peel and hit my head on the floor. I say this with as much humility as I'm able to muster is, these are men who are up there in years. So how many more years do they have left? Hopefully many. Right? I don't know. But what I'm simply saying is instead of enjoying time with family, like taking the time that they've spent in public service and the hard work that they have done and presented, and whether you agree politically with these men or whether you don't, right? They've spent years and years and years in public service. And so it's like, thank you guys for the time that you've spent in that service. And it's like, why would you not spend these years that you have remaining to go and enjoy your family, enjoy friends? If you don't have close relationship with your family, then, what do you enjoy? Do you enjoy, just going and spending that time in these years in ways that, would be restful and hopefully beneficial to them? And it's like, well, there's great purpose in what I'm like, okay, I hear that, but you physiologically aren't able to do what you're supposed to do. And that's the case for both of these individuals. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, so this very clearly demonstrates to me somebody clinging to power. And my question would be, why? Like, what's the point? And next, what we're going to go into is kind of more of an answer to that question. And it's more of a psychology of clinging to power. So I want to give credit to the source that I'm drawing from for this. So this is a blog or an article written by a gentleman by the name of Mark Wagner, who was writing on behalf of, and I'm not saying this wrong when I say this, by the way, it's the Australasian Leadership Institute. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the link to this in the description. And that's more so just to ensure that credit is given where it's due, since I'm referencing so much of his work on this, but also if it's something that, this piques an interest for you and you want to take a look at it, it's, I think it's informative and interesting. So it could be worth the time for the read. So when he talks about people wanting to cling to power, like, so you have Cincinnatus in the ancient world, not clinging to the dictatorship of ancient Rome, but in the current American Republic, Democratic Republic we live in, we have people on both sides of the political aisle where they're physiologically degraded to the point to where they're starting to lose the ability to function, yet they're still holding on and clinging to these positions of power. And what's informing that? Like, what's the difference between the two? And so in this article, number one, before we go into that, you got to lay the framework of what he calls self-esteem and self-image. Because he uses these two as a psychological comparison as to one weighing over the other or one being more important than the other, the influences and the impacts and the second, third, or fourth order effects that has. So self-esteem would be how much you like and value yourself. Self-image is a mental picture or perception someone has of themselves. So how somebody sees themselves inwardly and in relation to the world around them. So that's the difference between self-esteem and self-image, and that's going to be important as we go forward. So what Mark Wagner talks about is if your self-image is superior to others, then losing whatever is giving you that sense of superiority. You can apply this to politicians. You can apply this to a myriad of other places where people have power or influence or authority, right? You could even apply that probably into the entertainment industry, which professional athletes are in the entertainment industry, but more in terms of, say movies or movie stars, people in that world. And so what would someone cling on to that end, right? So if this is what's feeding that self-image that you have of, hey, this is what's giving me that sense of superiority that I have over other people, to what end would I be willing to cling on to that, to maintain that self-image that I have for myself? And that's kind of what he touches on. So what I want to go into next is I just want to go through some quotes directly from what he said and then just kind of give some opinions on it on the back end. So one of the quotes that Mark Wagner has is, so when the perception that they have of themselves is valued over their own value of themselves or their self-esteem, they are drawn to that self-image. In fact, they become addicted. And that's where the biological aspect comes into play. And so when it talks about the biological aspect of things, and this can be applied to power, and I don't know if anybody's ever been in a situation where they've had either power over other people or they've been in a situation where they felt powerful, there's a dopamine dump that comes into the brain. And dopamine can be addictive. And that's when he's talking about the biology that's behind it. And so the next quote is, we have a level of self-esteem and a series of self-images, and this is going to be more of what right looks like in terms of transitioning away from power in a healthy way. So think Cincinnatus on this example. We have a level of self-esteem and a series of self-images, and the self-image that values us most highly is the one that we are drawn to, and chemicals are released in our brain to increase our connection to this particular self-esteem. So that's the dopamine dump. That's all fine, but the problem arises when the most important self-image is in threat of being taken away. So is that a political self-image? Is that an entertainment self-image? Is that a professional athlete self-image? Whatever that may be. If a person has a level of self-esteem that is equal or greater than their self-image, so the value of themselves is equal to or greater than their perceived value of themselves, then there is less of a reliance on that self-image, so the transition is smooth. So think about Cincinnatus. So his self-esteem, his value of himself as a farmer, that exceeded his self-image in terms of his perceived understanding of himself as a dictator of Rome, did not supersede his value of himself as a farmer. Therefore, his transition out of the dictatorship back to his farm was a healthy one. And so now we're going to take a real quick look at what wrong looks like in terms of comparison with professional athletes. And then what we'll do is we'll kind of tie a bow on this and kind of bring this, why people cling on to power, the self-image, the self-esteem, the more the psychological or biological element of power and how it relates to this. And then we'll transition into worldview. So this quote regarding sports people is this: this is common with sports people who have to retire. On the pitch, they have a high sense of value, a hero in a lot of people's eyes. And when that is taken away, they become just a normal person. And if their self-esteem, so their value of themselves, right, is less than their self-image, so the perception that they have of themselves as a footballer, of a sports person, which is when dopamine is released, it's like an addict who has been cut off from their drug. And so I think about that in light of power and the fickleness of power and clinging on to power. So why do people cling on to power? And it's like, okay, well, what this is kind of telling us is, number one, their image of themselves, the perception of that they have of themselves as a person of power, as a person of influence, maybe even as a person of meaning. So we want to talk about meaning and purpose in this podcast. So it's like maybe their meaning is tied up in what their position of power and influence is, politically, athletically, whatever the case may be. So that image that they have of themselves supersedes their value, and so that's a worldview thing. How do you define your value? What about your worldview informs why you're valuable, how you're valuable? What gives you value? What do you find it in? Well, if you find it in the position of power that you have, you're going to cling on to that power until the plane flies into the ground. And so as you consider that in light of worldview, and as we kind of bring that section on psychology behind it and biology behind it to a close, what I then want to do is transition into the idea of meaning and worldview as it relates to the fickleness of power. And as discussed, throughout these two episodes is regarding this topic, power it's temporary, it's volatile, it's unstable. So yet in spite of this, and then I said this at the beginning of the episode, in spite of this and in spite of this reality, why do so many people pursue it? I mean, they're willing to do anything to get it, at the expense of other people, at the expense of themselves, to achieve and to attain power. And it's like, all you have to do is do a brief Google search on the fickleness of power, and it's just filled with historical examples of this is how this is going to end. You're going to end in exile. You're going to end getting defeated. You're going to end getting outmaneuvered by somebody who previously was a friend or an ally, and now they're an enemy. It's like, why? What's the point? Like, why would you pursue that? When it comes to the reality of our lives, what about our worldview informs that, right? And that's what I want to get into in this next part. So what I want to do on this is I want to present my worldview and how I would respond to this. I've been kind of general in my approach to worldviews. I haven't honed in on one or the other. And so what I don't want to do is I don't want to be on the fence and be like half foot in, half foot out. It's like, just to play that game. I want to be very clear about what my worldview is and how I approach these issues. Not everybody's going to agree with me, and not everybody is going to align with me on my worldview. That's completely fine. I just want it to be known this is how I approach things. But also with that, the general point of even if somebody disagrees with my worldview and has no intention of giving any thought to the worldview that I present, that's not the point, right? What I'm trying to convey and what I'm trying to say is thinking about these matters and how our worldview informs how we consider them, how we respond to them. Regardless of what your worldview is, I stand on the fact that I believe that that is a healthy and good thing because I think it reduces sensationalism. I think it reduces what we talked about in the episode on Words Matter, right? Which is being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, right? So being slow to anger, I think one of the things that really helps with that is knowing what you believe, why you believe it, how that informs the things happening around you, because that will then in turn, I think, incline people to be quicker to be able to listen because they're not as rattled and shaken by other people presenting things that may run counter to what they're saying or believing. That's why I think that regardless of what your worldview is, it's a very healthy thing to approach things like this. And it's really one of the driving factors in me wanting to do this podcast at all, because I just think that that's something that's really stuck out to me and something that I've learned in my life, not as a result of me being wise or knowing, but as a result of me being an absolute gong show on multiple occasions of my life and just learning the lessons the hard way. So when it comes to worldview and applying this to the fickleness of power, I kind of have this note that I wanted to read here. And it specifically says, yet in spite of this being an obvious reality, that power is so fickle, for anyone who looks at the past and the examples of power that I said earlier, but people are still wanting to achieve it. They're wanting to cling on to it. They're wanting to go after it to the point of lunacy. And it's like their worldview is informing that, even if they don't know that. So I have this question right here that I want to read. So what is your assumption about there being sovereign power over everything else? And is there an inevitable accountability for everyone, regardless of who you are, whether you right now sit in the most powerful position in the world, or whether you sit in the least powerful position in the world? Do you have a worldview that informs your understanding that everybody on this earth, regardless of their standing, everybody has an account that has to be given? Do you or do you not? And so for me, I have an assumption in my worldview. I carry the assumption that there is a God who exists that is sovereign over all things, and that everything that is happening on this earth is happening beneath the sovereignty of God. And so with that assumption comes the reality for me that there's more than just this life. That's something that I believe. That's an assumption that I have about my worldview informs that there is more than just this life. So as I think about that, in regards to how I would apply that to the idea of the fickleness of power, there's two things that I wanted to do. First is a quote from a gentleman named C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis says this: as long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. I think that if people entering into power do so underneath the worldview assumption that there is something else above them, that as they wield power over others, they wield power beneath a greater power. And I think that that is an assumption that for somebody in power would inform them, this is a very temporary thing that I have, that I hold in this position of power in which I sit or stand. And so I also look at, in the Bible, there's many books in the Bible, and one of them is from the Old Testament. The Jews would call it the Torah, and that's Psalms chapter 2. And in that, there's two things in that chapter that are said as regards to kind of the idea of power. And that is a question initially, which is, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And then there's also another quote in that says, he who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. And from that Psalms, it's kind of hinting at the reality of Everybody is raging on this earth against each other. People, jockeying for power, positioning for power, aligning their interest, and then getting power and then fighting it. It's like all of that is happening beneath the reality for me and my worldview that, hey, there is a greater sovereign power under which we all live. And operating inside of that reality, how does that then inform my understanding of power? It's an empty pursuit if it's nothing more than for the means and the ends of wanting power for the sake of power. Go back to the George Orwell quote in the previous episode. What's the end pursuit of power? It's power. And that, from my worldview and perspective, is a very empty vessel. To pursue power for the sake of power, it's like, well, that means nothing, because in the end, there is a greater power that is sovereign over all things. And so what does that power tell me about, and what assumptions do I gain as a result of that understanding and believing, okay, like, since that's the case, maybe the most impactful or matterful thing isn't to pursue power, but maybe it's to pursue something else. Instead of pursuing power, right, which is to be known, which is to be appreciated, which is to be held in honor, right? Instead of pursuing that, how about pursuing obedience and faithfulness and love and obscurity, where no one in the end may know, right? No one may appreciate, but it doesn't matter, because there is a greater power that is sovereign over all. And that is the appreciation that I'm seeking and that I'm pursuing and that I'm desiring. I'm not desiring the self-image that gives me this idea of influence over other people from which I draw my meaning. I draw my meaning from the assumption that I believe that there is a sovereign creator over all things who actually cares and loves me, and that then informs my value, that informs my understanding of, hey, I don't need to pursue power for the sake of power, to then have that sense of dopamine dropping into my brain and then getting addicted to that feeling and that sense of power and influence over other people, which then informs my self-image, which gives me meaning. And it's like, that's not the end pursuit of what I want. That's my worldview informing how I understand power. Is that, okay, now if I live my life faithfully and obediently, and that road inevitably leads to being in a position of power and influence, then I understand that I'm not there because I want to be there for my own ends and my own means. I'm there because there is a sovereign God who has led me to that point, and everything done in that position is to be done in a way that is humble and glorifying to this God that I assume, I have an assumption that this God exists and that I operate beneath his sovereignty. That's how my worldview informs the idea of power. And so that being the case, I would then encourage anybody who thinks differently than I do, who doesn't agree with my worldview, or who approaches with a different worldview, do the mental dialogue to come to the conclusion of what your worldview says about power, about pursuing power. Now, if it's of a different outcome, I'm not here to be preachy. I'm not a pastor. That's not what I'm trying to do. If anybody wants to go and hear a pastor, go to a church. That is not what I'm trying to do. And that's not, I believe that would be wrong to do that. That's not what this is about. This is about me presenting my worldview and then also encouraging other people, whether they align with my worldview or not, to consider things like the idea of the fickleness of power. Consider that in light of your worldview. Identify a worldview, what your worldview is, how those assumptions then inform your understanding of certain things like this. Then will then, in turn, like I've said, connecting it to some of the previous podcasts, will hopefully deter a little bit of that sensationalism, deter a little bit of that anger, because you know what you think, you know what you believe. That's going to make you more inclined to listen without being quick to respond or speak because you feel rattled or insecure. But through that listening, then in turn, hopefully that can potentially result in being a little bit slower to anger. I think that that's a positive thing for humanity. And so that's why I want to present what I presented right there and encourage others, regardless of your worldview, to consider the idea of power from that perspective and in that light, in terms of, here are my assumptions, and then these then in turn inform my understanding of this. And so what I wanted to then turn to is considering the fickleness of power as it relates to response. And what I mean by that is kind of hearkening back to the previous episode. In the end, what I talked about is how all of these historical examples, these individuals pursuing this power has a very significant and far-reaching impact on the common man. And then we went through all 5 of those historical examples, and that as we laid that out, we came to the understanding of over 100 million people are dead based off of those 5 historical examples alone, as a result of the pursuit of power and the fickleness of power. And so my question is how does that, from a common man's perspective, considering that in light of my worldview, how does that influence the reality of response? And so I look at that in kind of two mediums. The first is the response of, do I do anything about it as it regards to positioning myself to pursue power, not positioning myself to pursue power. And so for me, my response to that is going to be the last thing that I talk about on this podcast episode, which is going to be contentment. So for me, when it comes to the pursuit of power, the response for me in my worldview is not to pursue it. There's nothing to be pursued there. It's an empty vessel. It's about living your life faithfully, consistently, contently. And then if that is, my assumption and belief that there is a sovereign God who is guiding and directing the steps of my life, if I'm walking faithfully in obedience and in humility and in love of my neighbor and of the Lord, if that's taking place and the Lord guides that path to a position of power and influence, then to wield the power in that position humbly and to do so in a way that is always mindful that there is a greater sovereign power that exists above me or above someone in that position, and that power is not to be wielded for the benefit of self, but to the benefit of others and to the glory of God. So when it comes to the idea of the pursuit of power, don't do it, pretty much is the response. Now, what about in response to the reality of 100+ million people dead as a result of people pursuing power and the fickleness of power in light of that? And I guess for me, this is an ethical question that's a challenge. And it kind of harkens to the idea or the quote that evil prevails when good men do nothing. So it's the idea of, is there an element to resisting evil when it's in power? That's really a question that, honestly, as I ask that question to myself, that's an area that I think I need to really weigh and understand of, for me, in my worldview, I assume that there is a God that is good, that is sovereign, that is active, that is involved in what he has created. I assume and believe that there is more than just this life. So should those things inform a, not so much pacifistic, but more of a, I'm not going to get caught up in these things. I'm not going to be ready to grab my pitchfork and run out into the driveway. However, if you have responsibilities in this life, family, for instance, and understanding that, the second, third, fourth order effects of someone coming into a position of power that does great evil and injustice to the common man, it's like, how do I approach that situation from bearing the responsibility of caring for and protecting my family and my community? What's the ethical balance there in light of worldview? And so I think about that, and that's less of a answer to the question of response, and more of me just kind of spitballing the reality of that's an area that I need to kind of think about and weigh and come to a better understanding of how my worldview informs that. And I think that would be an interesting dialogue to have, not even interesting, but very necessary to understand, okay, like ethically, this is how I approach this from my worldview and how I would navigate it. So what I want to do to close this episode out is I want to just kind of go towards the idea of contentment. And I hinted earlier about contentment, but before I do that, I want to be very clear to verbalize this in regards to the idea of power and power changing and being content. In America, up to this point, we still, for the most part, change power from one political party to the next or from one election cycle to the next. We typically are doing that peacefully. And I want to be very clear to say that I understand completely that we are the exception and not the rule when it comes to power changing hands. And the reality is that for a lot of countries, not all, now it's not a broad blanket, there are places that this doesn't happen. However, a lot of the times power changing is an extremely violent event. And so as I go into applying the reality of contentment when it comes to the idea of power and power changing, power being fickle, I want to do so with humility, understanding it that I approach it from a very spoiled perspective, having grown up and lived in a nation that has been, in terms of inside the confines of the border in which I live. Now, this isn't, again, a broad stroke. I know that there's people today who are in places in the United States who every single day they see violence, they experience uncertainty, they experience things that would be tantamount to a combat environment. So I want to be very clear on all these things, understanding that for me and my perspective, I want to approach this from not only a place of contentment, but a place of gratitude. I have so much to be grateful for, so much to be thankful for. And I want to be very careful to ensure that people who do not find themselves in circumstances such as mine, I give credence to each and every one of them by acknowledging verbally that while I'm talking about these things, I know that there are people who are in circumstances that I cannot fathom. And it's easy for me to talk about this. It would be completely different to live it out in different circumstances. My only hope is that I can pray that, my worldview would be found genuine in that time. And there's nothing I can do other than hope and pray about that. But my worldview tells me to be content. My worldview tells me that there's going to be times of hunger, and then there's going to be times of being satisfied. There's going to be times that are going to be abundant. There's going to be times that there's going to be great need. My worldview tells me that there's going to be times of health and good health. And then my worldview also tells me that there's going to be times of sickness. And so my worldview tells me that there's going to be dichotomies in life. And that's always going to be the case. And that I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. That's what my worldview tells me. So what does that tell me about considering power? What does that tell me about the ebbs and flows of power? It tells me to be content. It tells me to embrace obscurity. My worldview tells me that I can do all of those things because I can have great rest and peace in the Creator that has authority and sovereignty over all things. And the assumption that I have that Creator exists then gives me the peace and the contentment that I need to be able to look at these positions of power and these influences of power, these changes in power, these ebbs and flows of power, and not get caught up in fear, uncertainty, sensationalism, anger, but to consider them with wisdom, to consider them in light of the reality of the world in which I live, to consider them in light of the reality of the influences that it can have on those for whom I'm responsible. But in the end, to remember that I have an assumption that gives me great comfort and confidence and contentment in knowing that regardless of how these ebbs go, these ebbs of power come and go, that there's a lot of rest and peace and contentment to be had. And so I would encourage anybody who has a worldview that runs counter to mine, who would consider these in a different way, dig into your worldview, dig into what you understand. Now, I'm not a universalist. I want to be very clear on this point, and I want to be very clear when I say this. I'm not a universalist. I believe that I believe that truth is exclusive. I believe that there is one way, and that's Jesus Christ. That's what I believe. And I would encourage anybody to consider Jesus, to consider him. However, I know that there's going to be people who don't align with my worldview, who don't align with what I believe. And I would encourage others that regardless of whether they align with what I think or not, consider these things in reality of your worldview, as I've said. Dig in, think about them, take the time to consider them, because I truly believe, and again, this is not a preachy thing. I'm just encouraging people if they have any interest. If it's like, hey, dude, keep it to yourself, completely respect that. But I just think that it's something that I've learned, and I hope that if there's anybody that could potentially benefit from it, I think that that's a really good and positive thing. So that's going to conclude this two-part series on power and the fickleness of power. And I hope it's been informative. I hope it's been a benefit to anybody who's taken the time to listen. But again, if you did take some time to tune in, and whether you share my worldview, whether you don't, I appreciate you. And I thank you for the time, and I hope you have a wonderful day. So thanks, and have a good one.